Just let folks get in here and make sure that everybody's on before we get started.
Hi, everybody. Why don't we go ahead and get a little bit of a start here? We've got an excellent presentation for you today. It's going to take a couple hours and it'll be recorded. So if you miss this intro, come back on Zoom and you can get us. But you want to kick us off, Thomas?
Thank you for joining us. Hello, everyone. My name is Thomas Plank, and I am WLA's Communications Coordinator for Colorado River Basin water issues. I'm covering today for Morgan Wagner, our Water Program Director, who's out with laryngitis, but will still be engaging with questions in the chat. Our water team is focused on helping working lands in the West thrive despite water scarcity, whether from drought, over-appropriated watersheds, or declining aquifers.
And hi, everybody. I'm Linda Poole. I'm the Working Lands Director for Western Landowners Alliance. I'm so glad you're here today. Our Working Lands team brings together landowner perspectives, science, policy, and finance to sustain private and public working lands at scale in ways that are swift, durable, collaborative, and cost-effective. See if I can get this thing to advance here. Well, we almost did. So what we wanted to talk to you all about and with you all about today is drought and water scarcity, because that's something that unites not just our working lands and water teams at the Western Landowners Alliance, but it matters to all of us as people who care for and care about the West. And here in Montana, where I live, it's a very timely thing to be talking about. Our grasses this spring turned green for about a week and then started to immediately dry up. So we're headed for quite a drought. There's quite a leg here in getting this to move. And we're not alone in this. So our speakers today, Dave from South Dakota has 100% of their state in drought right now. Bret Riley from New Mexico, 99.9% of the state is in drought. And this is something that we face not just a year at a time, but quite often, a series of years. So this is from the US Drought Monitor, and you can go in there and you can pull a table that goes from the year 2000 to last year. And what you can see is I'm not sure we could call what I go through a drought, because it's drought more often than it's not drought. And that means that we really have got to be thinking about ways to manage through really dry times. And I love this graphic from Understanding Ag, Gabe Brown, Alan Williams, and them, and the idea of what we can do to deal with drought through our management of the land itself. And so we're talking in this whole thing about water, which actually makes us end up talking about soil, the topic of today's meeting. And what we do on our own property is part of a bigger cycle. So we are here in this field water cycle of precipitation, evapotranspiration, plant uptake, and infiltration down into the soil, but that's what feeds the streams and moves us forward over time. It allows us to be neighbors to the humans and the wildlife that live downstream from us. And so this is something that might seem like it's out there a little bit to be talking about soil solutions to water scarcity, but every time we put our livestock out on the ground, we're making decisions about the drought resilience of our property moving forward. And so today we'll be talking about how some of those strategies can work out, how to look at whether it's working, and learn just a little bit about the soil health. These pictures will probably make a lot more sense after we're through this than they do to you right now. How much does this really matter? You know, it takes a lot of time and energy to really focus on soil health, especially when you're facing drought. The first thing we think about with webinars and drought is we think about how to destock or alternative feed sources or early weaning. What we're talking about today are things that ranchers, farmers, foresters can do every day in their management, and it does make a difference. For every 1% increase in the soil organic matter that you make in the top 6 inches, you can hold another 25,000 gallons of water, a little more, a little less, depending upon your soil conditions and soil types. But that really adds up, as this graphic from NRCS shows. Just a 1% increase across US cropland in the soil organic matter is the amount of water that flows over Niagara Falls in 150 days. And so what we'll be talking about today is how to make the most out of every drop of moisture that we get. And we've got just the people here to be able to help us with that.
And so we'd like to welcome you all to WLA's 5th webinar of 2025, a discussion on the soil solutions to water scarcity that will highlight proven soil health strategies to help build drought resilience and healthy water cycles across working lands. WLA offers around one webinar each month. You can find all our past webinars on the WLA YouTube channel or on our website, and a link to April's Irrigating for Food and Fish, Water Infrastructure and Healthy Streams webinar is there in the chat. The last water webinar for spring, on June 25, will explore the topic of compensated water savings programs. And the next Working Lands webinar will be on June 11th, hearing from top producers using targeted grazing to create habitat for wildlife and to deal with wildfire and weeds. You can find more about these virtual events and can register for them using the link in the chat. We've got 2 wonderful speakers today, Dave Ollila from South Dakota and Bret Riley from New Mexico and Oklahoma. Both are ranchers who've weathered good years and bad, and who've learned ways to manage their lands to make the most of every drop of moisture they receive. We'll get to them in a few seconds, but first, a minute about WLA.
Today's webinar comes to you from the team at Western Landowners Alliance, and we're a landowner-led, nonpartisan organization that advances policies and practices that sustain working lands, connected landscapes, and native species across the American West. We focus on empowering landowners and managers with the resources, knowledge, and public policies to support land and water stewardship. And these virtual learning and networking sessions are just one way that we do that. It's my pleasure to introduce our support team for today's event. Danny Howlett, I'm not seeing Danny in here, but maybe she is here. She's WLA's Outreach and Membership Coordinator. Matt Smith, manager of the Headwaters of the Colorado Initiative, and Christina Wernikowski, WLA's very able communications associate. Thanks again for joining us today.
The format for today's meeting starts with a webinar panel approach. For the first hour, we'll hear from Dave and Bret, both experienced grassland ranchers, about the why, what, and how of managing grazing lands for soil health, and how that can help landowners succeed even in hot, dry conditions. In the second hour, we'll open the floor, inviting everyone to turn on their cameras, ask one another questions, share experiences, and take a deep dive into the topic of soil health practices to abate water scarcity. We recognize that landscapes, communities, and water management decisions are incredibly diverse throughout the West, and that no one program, policy, or practice can fix the pressing issues of our time. The purpose of these webinars is simply to share information and provide an opportunity for landowners and experts to exchange knowledge and find ways to build a more resilient future for us all. Quick reminder, please use the chat function. You can find it at the bottom of your screen to post your questions or comments. If you'd like to introduce yourself and where you're from in the chat, please do. People from all across the West and far beyond join these webinars, and we love to see your names. Also, keep an eye on the chat throughout the meeting for helpful resources and materials that the WLA team will be sharing. Thanks, Christina. And please feel free to share your own resources there too.
And so here we go. Our guests today have seen many a dry year in their lives. Hopefully, not too many more in the future, but I guess we have no choice about that. We'll deal with whatever comes along towards us. We have found ways to prosper through drought, and today Dave and Bret are here to tell us how they have done that. Dave Ollila is a lifelong rancher from South Dakota and also a soil health technician for a wonderful landowner-led group. I hope you'll look up the South Dakota Soil Health Coalition. They're an outstanding group. Dave, his wife Holly, and their family run a Ramblay sheep and farming operation that's won multiple awards over the years. And we have Bret Riley, who ranches in southeast New Mexico and western Oklahoma, as well as being a WLA team member. Bret is our Eastern New Mexico Resource Coordinator. Bret is also co-chair for the Lesser Prairie Chicken Landowner Alliance, another thing I'd love for you to look into, bringing together the idea of ranching and prairie chickens, wildlife. And with that, we will get started with our questions. Dave, I'd like to start with you. Can you please tell us just a little bit about your background in working on soil health and what the impact of that soil health is on water retention? Then tell us a little bit about the outcomes that you've seen from applying the soil health principles, like keeping living roots in the ground or keeping the ground covered.
Well, hi, everyone, and thanks for having me, Linda and gang. I appreciate the opportunity to share. But yeah, my soil health journey started out about 30 years ago. I started no-tilling at that time and thinking that was the answer, but I didn't do it on an idea of conservation. I was teaching school and didn't have time to make those patches in the field like traditional farming does. And somebody showed me this no-till idea and I got going down that path. And the reason I bring that up is a lot of what I understand about soil health comes from my background in rangeland management and rangeland health, which it's the same thing because you're mimicking nature and that's your goal. But it was interesting to find through the actual cropping side of things, the greater impact and what's actually happening out on the prairie. So it's been a 35, 40-year journey to get there. And what's interesting is when you start down that path, and so let's say we start lessening disturbance and leaving residue, and that's what no-till lets you do in the cropping world. Well, then you find out, well, that piece is important and no-tilling is important, but then to get better, then there's another piece. And so that's where the 5 and now 6 principles come into play, because all that is rangeland management 101. That is the basic foundation, and you start there, but that's nature. And the outcomes of that are there's so many indirect impacts to those things. And our goal, when we start ranching is we want to run cattle and sheep is what we do. And so we're centered around that. But my journey has brought me around to center my thinking around the management of the land resource, and then looking at the livestock as one of those tools that help manage that land resource, because everything originates from there. And if we change that paradigm setting and how we look at that, it changes your whole point of view of how you're going to manage the land resource, which then ties in the drought planning and all the other considerations. And then the indirect impacts from that then is a lot of inputs are reduced, a lot of, so the financial side starts to get a better, or I wouldn't say better, but let's say a more consistent profit margin that gives you some predictability from year on year, rather than running in a boom and bust type of cycle that we do, especially when we're so dependent on water, making that year be successful. So when we get into these drought years, if we've already set our foundation, we're not having catastrophes or crisis when we're in the storm. And so then we can manage through those droughts. And no, you're not going to have the returns that you would in a good year, but you're not going to have the wrecks either, because those things are all pre-planned. And the beauty of it then is you become very adaptable. And that's one of the big results. And so what that gives us, if we were all to look into managing that way, you're going to have family units that are happier. You're going to have consistent production on your land resource, but then that impacts your local communities too. So the indirect results and some of those outcomes as we go down that path get very broad. But to get specifically, like you said, when we get into increasing organic matter, we get into holding more water. And you start holding more water, you keep your biology in the soil alive longer during that growing season. Because in our country, half of our rainfall happens April, May, June. And then we've got to make use out of that forage that was produced during that time to get through the rest of the year. So if we can extend our growing season and the nutritional density of the forage that we have produced, well, then that results in a lot of better livestock health. You put in some practices of rotations, and you're moving. In our case, we're moving every 2 weeks. So we've broke a parasite cycle, both in our cattle and sheep, so we don't have to use anthelmintics. But we check, we test for them, we do fecal samplings, and that's one of those ahas. Well, yeah, that works. And again, healthy animals, but also lessens the labor impacts on the humans, and we don't have those worries. And we're coming into when we're weaning animals that they have better gains because they are healthier. They haven't been impacted by disease or by parasites. So it is funny how I didn't set out on this course. I was going to run sheep and cattle and teach school for a while and then ranch the rest of my life, but the good Lord had different plans in that. So I ended up down this journey of soil health. And because it's so intriguing, you can see the benefits of it, not just from a production point of view, but wildlife, and obviously nature responds. And that's one of the key takeaways is nature's very forgiving if we stop having bad behavior and start working with nature and trying to mimic nature. We can certainly come to a happier and less stressful, more productive way of life.
Thank you so much, Dave. Bret, can you tell us a bit about your background managing Southern Plains grasslands? And based on that, can you share what grazing practices or soil interventions you found most effective in creating more drought resilient systems in the face of increased water scarcity?
Sure. Thank y'all for the invitation today. Yeah, we ranch in southeast New Mexico. We've got a little bit of hard country up on the cap, but most of our country out there is in the rolling sand hills. So that in of itself is a challenge at times. We also have a little place there in western Oklahoma. So, certainly two different types of landscapes. New Mexico country gets about half the rain Oklahoma does. So, it makes you, I've always heard that, the higher the rainfall, the better manager you are. And that's makes up for more mistakes, obviously. So, yeah, it's when we first bought the ranch out there, we knew we were going to be under the lens, I guess, somewhat. We're probably on the southern end of the lesser prairie chicken habitat now in the United States. So we're a checkerboard ranch out there. We've got BLM state lands and private lands intermingled. So the management of it is kind of, you kind of have to work together and do a lot of collaboration. One thing that we have found over the years is, when we bought this ranch, or I guess we leased it 17 years ago, and bought it right after that, what we found was that, we'd been used to running cattle. We ran cattle our whole life, but in different types of landscapes. And what we found down here was our normal rest rotations might not be good enough. So we started exploring things. I was very fortunate to be able to attend some seminars and some short courses with Jeff Goodwin when he was back at the Noble Foundation. Jeff has since moved on to A&M, but really kind of lit the fire in me to see how we could manage these landscapes a little bit better. So as we manage nowadays, there's a lot more metrics involved than what there was in the beginning. You know, the beginning, you go out and you put a 2 or 3 year rest rotation program together and you say, well, I'm going to stick to this. And you still have to do that. You still have to have a basis, but adaptability, like Dave said a while ago, is the key. You know, we feel like in our country, so that, you know, it's not only the annual precipitation you get, but it's when that precipitation comes. You know, we can get it in the spring, summer, fall, winter. I mean, last year we had no rain basically until the end of August, and we had 5 inches in one event, and then we had another 5 inches in October. So, you know, pretty much 75–80% of our annual precip was in those 2 events, and we still grew a tremendous amount of feed. And so I think that's the key to it. Is I look at it over the years, and what's changed for us is that I think if we pay attention to the soil health principles, you know, we're very big on trying to eliminate bare ground as much as we can. Of course, you know, ranching in the sand is, like I said, is a challenge because it's not as stable as what the harder country will be, but it also has some benefits. We had a research project on us, and I'll talk about it a little later, but, you know, we found that, you know, that country that, you know, was rested more, I think is very essential. You know, we try to rest at least a growing season every 3 years if we can on all our pastures. A complete rest, don't utilize it at all. And I think that's been a key. I also feel like dormant season grazing, how you graze that country in the dormant season, is very critical. I think what we try to do is follow up after our rest periods. If we have some precip and we've got some, you know, our grasses head out, and we try to come in there in the winter and do some dormant season, maybe, you know, eliminate some bare ground, knock some forage down on the ground, and then also scatter some grass seed really seems to help us. I think that, you know, when you talk about the economics of it, I think one thing that's critical that we found, and you know, some of the ranchers around us are you know, still struggle with a little bit maybe, is the fact that, you know, by going to this route and utilizing the soil health principles and managing for that, you know, we still have to pay attention to the economics, right? We've all still got bills to pay, and we got ranches to pay for, kids to put through college, but, you know, they talk about the 3-legged stool, where we've got the economics, you know, the ecological health and the societal, you know, aspect of these operations. And so I really feel like, you know, if we focus on the ecological, which what we've tried to do, you know, it kind of makes up for the other two, or it helps anyway. You know, if we can keep these ranchers ranching, and hopefully, you know, try and figure out ways to bring the younger generations on board, I think that's a win. We also have to look at, you know, the economics of it. I mean, it's not the easiest thing to do, right? I mean, if you're starting to pay attention to soil health principles, you're probably not maximizing the economic potential of those landscapes. So there's you know, you have to kind of little give and take there sometimes, and sometimes it's a challenge. So what we found though is that country that we've been, you know, managing this way, you know, we have a lot more resiliency. We're a lot less susceptible to drought. We kind of manage our country as if we're on the edge of a drought every year because of, like that graph Linda showed. I mean, it seems like, you know, more times than not, we are in a drought. I mean, I talked to the old timers in this part of the world, and they say the sand country does better in the average or below average, you know, precip years, and the tighter country does better when it's above average. And, you know, our old sand is pretty resilient. So what we found is that, by utilizing that, we haven't sold a cow in the last 15 years because of drought. Now we've grazed some old feed, you know, and had to supplement maybe a little bit more here and there, but it's allowed us to keep our genetics together. And I think that's something that's really important that we don't think about a lot of times when we think about the, you know, the ups and downs of the markets and droughts. And, you know, what does it cost the producer to go in there and have to sell the genetics that you've spent years and years putting together, and then have to go back and replace them if you do have to sell out. So I think there's a lot of economic value there that's probably a hidden value. You know, like today, I mean, I saw some 2-year-old heifers, you know, with calves on them, and they were nice heifers, but not, you know, I wouldn't call them great heifers, but they were bringing 4,200 to 4,500, you know, at the sale board. So if somebody had sold out in the last few years when we were dry, and they're trying to go back in there right now and restock, I mean, it's just economically, it's not feasible. So I think those are some of the things that we have to think about when we talk about, you know, managing, you know, these large landscapes. And I also think that soil health is the one thing that we all can get around. It doesn't matter if you're a production agriculturalist, if you're into the biodiversity and the wildlife aspect of it, if you're into a lot of different parts of utilizing landscape, soil health is still important because, that biomass that we grow out of those soils is, what we're all looking for, whether it be, for livestock to utilize the forage or for, the wildlife for, habitat. So yeah, I think it all ties together. And I would say that the grazing patterns that we put together and the way we've managed that country has helped us in times of lower precip, which again, we have quite a bit. And one other thing I might add right quick is that what we find is, have found over the years, is that since we've gone to this way of managing, our country responds a whole lot faster now after we have a rain event. We might be dry for 6-8 months, maybe even 12 months. But when we do get that precip, it seems like it rebounds so much faster because that microbiology and the root system in those plants are healthy, and it makes a big difference. So.
Wow, so much wisdom in what both Dave and Bret had to talk about. And I heard a lot in there about adaptability, but starting with a plan. It's not have no plan and then do whatever comes up. It's have a really good plan and then know how to adapt it, which means know how to tell if something's working. And so that's what we'd like to talk about now. We'll start with you, Dave, and then we'll go to you, Bret, with a question of briefly, what do you use to guide your planning process and then your day-to-day management? How do you tell if you're headed in the right direction from day to day in dealing with water scarcity? So how about you, Dave?
Yeah, try that question again. I was trying to deal with my mute button.
Yeah, sorry. Really what we're trying to understand is how do you write your plan in terms of thinking about a drought that's going to come? And then how do you tell whether you need to change it? If it's all about adaptability, but you start with a plan, what do you use to make your plan? Yeah. And then how do you tell if it's working and you need to change things?
Yeah. So back to the paradigm that I shared earlier, are we livestock centered or are we land resource centered? And that kind of that forms your thinking, because if we're all worried about keeping livestock, and Bret made a good point, the result of good soil health allows you not have to answer that question very often, and you don't have to destock. But the thing is, if we're worried about keeping livestock and trying to push through a drought, that's probably not a very good plan, because we don't have control over some of those things, and we need to focus on what we can control. So looking at livestock as a tool, in that they are the ones that give us or generate our revenue, but still we're using them to manage that land resource so we can hold water, which would give us that length of grazing, or that production over a longer period of time during a drought. And then it's a lot of planning. Bret had touched on it too. That economics is how far over that barrel are we? Yeah, we put ourselves in a position that we have to win every year, and that we have to be in a high production potential every year. If we are, then that's not realistic, because in range country, at least in our country, half the years we're in drought and half the years we're out of drought, is what it's shown us over a period of time. So we always need to be planning for drought, and to overstock put this in peril, to not have a plan and watch, trigger dates and hope, well, it's going to rain kind of deal. That's too short-minded. We got to look at the long haul, and so the thing you have to figure out is, when you're looking at your ranch, is how many, NRCS and some of those other agencies can give you a pretty good idea of what your stocking rates could be under a conventional system. And if you start there, and that's kind of where I started, is, what could I carry? And then I put in my soil health practices, and I haven't increased my stocking rates, but I've been able to increase my weeding weights. And even in our country, in drought years, we actually have better weeding weights because we have harder grass, more nutrient dense grass at that time, and it stays vegetative. So understanding the context of your environment and what you're doing there will help you with that plan on what you can deal with. So as we go through that, we can look at if I can carry enough stock to make my payments and return some to family living and not get overzealous because I know we're going to have dry years, then I can do like what Bret was talking about, and you let a lot of that land rest. Or you have those options to say, okay, well, we're in a drought year. I'm going to utilize a little more here, a little more there. And that comes to being able to assess what you have for each stockpile out there. And I could tell you some years I grazed on what I'd left the year before. When we had an abundant year in 2011, we had grass that was 2 feet tall, which is really tall in our country. And the next year we had nothing. And so we were grazing on the grass from the year before to get through. So kind of understanding what your climate's like, what you're going to be up against, and not putting yourself in a win every year situation can help you work through and mitigate a lot of those drought issues.
Yeah, Bret, I've heard you talk so much about the importance of recovery, plant recovery. I also feel like you've done a lot of looking into cost-effective ways to see how your management is doing on the ground. I wonder if you could kind of add to what Dave was talking about and cover those points.
Yeah, thanks, Linda. Yeah, I think we look at ways to be cost effective. You know, it's just all inclusive, right? I mean, we never know what kind of precip we're going to have. We never know when it's going to come. So again, I keep going back to it as the prevailing sentiment here, but it's soil health. I mean, that's what it all goes back to. And so, as we manage these properties, on a day-to-day basis, like I said earlier, I mean, we have our, set rest rotations that we try to allow for. But again, I mean, especially when you're talking about these larger landscapes out in our part of the world, I mean, you might get rain on half the ranch, but you might not get it on the other half, and so that's one thing that you really have to be flexible about, is that you're, willing to, adjust with that and kind of roll with the flow, I guess, to some degree. I mean, it makes it's tough to, it's hard to make a one size fits all kind of a presentation, to folks, because there's so much difference in the landscapes, and that, not everything fits everybody, right? What might work for me might not work for Dave up there, with his growing season and some of the challenges he has, and vice versa. So I think what's, critical in this process is the fact that we pay attention to that soil health. We try to leave as much, forage as we can standing, but still, meet that criteria of the economic threshold that we have to go ahead and, make a living off these properties, because at the end of the day, that's what it's about. And, it's one thing we're really looking into very, I spend every day trying to find new sources of, what metrics are important for these ecosystem service markets, because I really feel like that's a key, for us to be able to shift a little bit of that economic, burden, you might say, over and be able to, upgrade our ecological health on these landscapes. And so I think it's something that, again, going back to soil health, and I probably sound like a broken record, but it's something that I'm concerned about as a producer. It's something that, those friends of mine that are in wildlife jobs or production, they're concerned about it. Folks that live in the middle of a metropolitan area, in the middle of this country, should be concerned about clean air, clean water, the things, like disappearing grasslands. I mean, we're losing 2 million acres of grasslands a year. So we have to come up with a way to, complete the cycle, right? I mean, we all talk about how we, the holistic approach, and probably the word gets used too much and people get burned out on it, but I don't think you can use it too much, because I think it takes all the different factors put together to make it work. I'm not sure, is that what you were talking about, Linda? Is that? where you wanted to head on that?
I could listen to you talk forever, Bret. I
Oh,
think
well, I don't know about that.
it's all good stuff.
Most
I
of the
think
rest of them probably couldn't, but no, I just think it's just, it's all inclusive, right? I don't think there's there's no one magic penny that's going to solve this problem. We have to take everything into account. We have to take our rainfall, the timing of the rainfall. We have to take our livestock production. I mean, Dave mentioned a while ago that, in years of drought yeah, there's certain times that, we might even have bigger calves than we did the year before just because those grasses are stronger. Or in years of high precip, our grass might get a little washy and our cattle might not do as good. I mean, that works both ways kind of. And so, I think you have to have a realistic plan of what you expect off your landscape. And then you also have to understand that there is, the first thing when we all went to college, they taught us was the law of diminishing returns, right? And so we've applied that on the economic basis of these landscapes, but we haven't really done it on the ecological side. And so I think that's our challenge, is to, find that sweet spot, if you will, on, where is the ecological health on everybody's landscape that they're managing? Where does that economic threshold meet that ecological threshold so that we can, maintain not only livestock production and the economic, well-being of these producers and our rural communities, but also, hold up on the end of the biodiversity, which, in my opinion, I think we could do it all if we do it the right way. We've seen it on our ranch. I mean, we've seen the habitat for, not only the chickens, but, all the other species that we have on the ranch really thrive under this type of rotation because and again, we're going to talk about it a little bit here in a little while, but when you have healthy soils, you have a healthy ecosystem. And if you have a healthy ecosystem, things are functioning. Everything has a cycle, right? Water cycle, livestock have a cycle, wildlife has a cycle. So if we can keep that ecosystem healthy and functioning in the way it should be, and we do that by building up reserves, I spoke to a while ago, if your grasses and those root systems are healthy, you can withstand some pretty tough times. But they've got to be healthy and vice versa. If you don't have that, if you want to, like Dave talked a while ago about, if you're managing to that threshold, to that high threshold and that high expectation every year, then you're not going to have a whole lot of reserves, and we can't, certainly, I don't know of anywhere, I mean, like I said, we get twice as much rain in Oklahoma and we can't manage that every year to expect, that standard rainfall every year. So we have to have, I think what we have to do is take a deep breath and get some realistic expectations of what these landscapes will do, and then combine, like I said, the ecological and the economic together. And sometimes it's tough. So.
Yeah. So I'm just imagining that people who are listening in are probably champing at the bit saying, I want to have specifics on here. And we can get into that in the second hour if people stay. But just to catch you up a little bit, we had a preliminary call with Dave and Bret to talk about this. And one of the things I heard from Dave that I thought was interesting, and maybe we can follow up on that in the second hour, is planning for forage production, thinking about how this year might shape up and, what your stocking rates might look like. He talked about using a 24-month precip record and being able to use that to look at what's happened in the past and what you've had for feed and what you might have going forward. My favorite tool for that is the rangeland analysis platform. I love that thing. It works all over the West, and we can, if you have interest in that, we can talk about that a little later on. I heard Bret and Dave both talk about the importance of, we're thinking about soil health. Well, actually, we're thinking about drought, which makes us think about soil. But what we're measuring and looking at from day to day as producers is we're looking at the amount of bare ground. We're looking at the stubble height that is left behind. We're looking at the diversity of plants, which might think about the diversity of the rooting systems underneath. So we're, in a strange way, we're thinking about water, we're looking at plants, and we're managing those plants primarily through livestock. And so Dave and Bret both have a world of experience doing this. Bret is working with a really cool monitoring tool that maybe he can talk about in the second hour, but we probably better jump on to the rest of these questions here. Thanks, Dave. Thanks, Bret.
Thank you, Linda. And then Dave, this next question is coming at you. As someone who has worked on your properties as well as assisting landowners across South Dakota, working in different management systems across different soil types and different climates, what have you seen as the key soil management practices that have made the biggest difference for soil health and drought resilience?
That's a good question, and everybody's going to have different answers. The new principle that has been added to the soil health is context, and I start to think more and more that maybe that's the more important one. But I always used to say the biggest one is residue. Is if we don't keep our ground covered, we can't start anything else happening because biology cannot survive in that habitat if that ground's bare. And I have a slide that I think Linda put up there and we can kind of touch on a little bit, but that the residue is key to that. Another thing I like to giggle about, and Bret's probably run into that too, is if you don't leave half, that's the old rule, take half, leave half. But in these types of management situations, we can regulate that harvest of that forage, either leave more or we can even take less or take more if we want based on the goal in that pasture. Maybe we're getting too much residue. That's the thing too, and we can manage it. So if we learn how to manage our residue, then we can get more out of that soil, but we can get the soil health principles started. And Linda, if you could click to the one with the temperature thing, there's 2 thermometers. Go back to that one. I'll touch on it real quick. That one there's the first thing. Water should never hit bare soil. Nature does not function with bare soil. Doesn't have it. It's always covered. And going back to what I was saying, I giggle on it. I've got some neighbors with bad behavior who like to take every bit of forage produced there and leave a stubble height of about half an inch or an inch maybe. And guess whose snow I get? I get their winter moisture, and winter moisture to us is a big deal because even though snow, as we say, doesn't have a lot of moisture in it, it still covers the ground like a blanket, and it keeps us from losing moisture during the winter through sublimation. And that is huge come spring. If our soils are moist and we warm up, then production begins. But like Linda talked, when we're in a drought situation, and we don't have that moisture, we're not starting out in a very good setting. This gives a good example of the difference between bare ground and covered ground. And the cooler one is actually a cover crop, which even in itself isn't as good as native prairies and having good ground cover. But biology in the soil functions best at 70 degrees, just like we do in our houses. Most of us are going to have our thermometers set somewhere around that number. Well, that's how we function well, and we can just think about the biology in the soil needing the same way. And that starts with residue. You have to cover that ground, to insulate that ground, to hold that moisture, so the biology can function. And that's the cool thing. If you build biology because you've got residue, well, again, thinking about us, we're 70-some% water. Well, so is the biology in the soil. So as that biology completes its life cycle, it's capturing water and it's letting go water in a cycle within the soil. And that can't happen without residue.
We'll go back to Bret here with a question, Bret, and it goes back to some of the things that you've started to talk about. The mission of the Prairie Chicken Landowner Alliance that you co-chair says that prairie chickens and good ranching go hand in hand. WLA is just wrapping up a project with the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation's funding, thank you, NFWF, working in southeast New Mexico with Bret and other ranchers, and looking at the effects of adaptive grazing versus long rested, so pastures that have been rested for 15 or more years. Bret, can you tell us about the key findings of that project and what that means to you and other ranchers who are faced with drought, especially in the Southern Plains?
Yeah, thanks, Linda. Yeah, we were fortunate enough to be one of the participants in this grant. Probably started 3 years ago, I would say. I think so, because we're fixing to finish the first one. And what we did was we wanted to look at areas that had been managed, what we thought fairly decently, and then also we've got, there seems to be and has been a push, to set this up a little bit. There's been a push over the years from a lot of the bureaucrats and a lot of the agencies and stuff to concentrate on preservation versus conservation. And we particularly see that on these ranches out in the West where we've got, large percentage of BLM lands or state lease lands or Forest Service lands. And so, we knew, those of us on the ground could see a difference in the production on the ranches we were actively managing and those that, those landscapes that were being set aside, whether for wildlife or for whatever purpose. In our part of the world was for the lesser prairie chickens. So, we came in and we put together this program, and NIFWIF, like Linda said, was very kind to fund it. And so what we did is myself and a neighbor ranch were the ones that were actively grazing down in our country, in the sand country. We also had another participant up in the kind of some gypsum kind of country, harder country up there north of us, about 50 miles. But for today's purposes, I'll talk about ours. And so we had probably 47,000 acres between the two of us. And then we've got what the government put together as an ACC that they rest about 50,000 acres right between us. And then there were some other state parcels scattered. And so, we thought, well, let's compare what the soils are telling us on these different management practices. And so we brought in, a team from the Working Lands. What is it, Linda? Working Lands. I always forget their last name. Chris and Megan.
Lands Conservation. What
Conservation. You think I remember that one? So anyway, Chris and Megan came down, and a gentleman named Jesse June used to be the past director of the state BLM here in New Mexico, was very, very positive in helping us put together this. We brought some high school kids in. We brought a lot of the stakeholders in from the different agencies out in our part of the world. We even had some folks in West Texas that came in and helped us pull these samples. We pulled, I believe, over 400 soil samples. Took a couple of weeks to get them all pulled. Yeah, there's the study there on the screen. And so what we found was that, we measured, not only they took it and measured it for carbon concentration, but also for infiltration and we looked at the root system on different, varieties of grasses at different levels. And we also looked at water retention rates. So basically what we found was that on those lands that had been actively managed with livestock, where we had some disturbance, but, on a limited, I'm going to say a limited basis, but what we felt like was a proper amount of pressure on those lands and utilizations, we found that they had twice the carbon stores that the lands that had been, set aside had. And, when you really think about it, it makes sense. I mean, we're not, again, we talk about cycles, right? And, we don't have that nutrient cycle going. I think preservation has a way of causing a water cycle. And I think you get a lot more runoff, maybe not in our part of the world because it's sandy, but there will be a crust form on that land if we don't have any disturbance on it with hooves. We also found that the retention, let me go back. So we found that the water infiltration rate on these grounds, on the areas that had not been grazed, was higher than those that had been grazed. But when we went back and we looked at retention rates, they were much higher on the lands that had been grazed. Oh, there it is right there. So, what that tells me anyway, I'm not a soil scientist or like Dave or any of these folks on here, but what it tells me is the buildup of that organic matter in that, especially in our sand country, is holding that water at a higher rate than what it is where we don't have that organic matter being built up. And, it's one of the basic principles of soil health is to build up organic matter. So I just, we felt like, we might get the same rainfall, preservation versus conservation, or the right kind of grazing, but the utilization and what was there for the plants to utilize in the biomass was totally different. So it was very interesting presentation. We also did some work on where we gotten rid of some mesquite. That's a big push in our part of the world. We sprayed a lot of mesquite over the last 10 years and masticated some of it, trying to build habitat for chickens because they don't like any structure. So that's part of it too. And I can tell you right off bat, I mean, spraying the mesquite is a big positive in our part of the world to allow, especially on these areas where we have the, lower amounts of precip. And so it allowed us to, kind of study that. And thanks to, hats off to Megan and Chris and their crew, because they put in a lot of hours out there and really became, part of our ranching families, I guess you could say. We still stay in communication with them. We were working on another project with them, but it's been great. And this is the type of thing we need. We need to find real life, answers to some of the problems that we have out there. And so a study like this, I think was crucial in the fact that, again, going back to me, what it told me as a producer was, we really need to concentrate on conservation, not preservation. And so, I'm not saying every landscape needs to be grazed at a certain percentage, as far as an economic standpoint, but from an ecological standpoint, I think it all needs to have some disturbance in order to maximize the soil health there on those locations. So, that's pretty much it in a nutshell. Like I said, WLA did a great job of getting it put together, and Chris and Megan, and then we had lots of volunteers that helped. So a lot of people in the community came out and helped. And so, a lot of the local NRCS, State Land Office, BLM folks came out. So New Mexico Game and Fish, we had them there also. So hopefully we'll take the results of it and analyze it, and it'll allow us to maybe make some, maybe some adjustments on our management plans on these landscapes moving forward. So.
Thank you so much, Bret. And we're going to just do a final round of short answers. And the first question is going to be back to you, Bret. What is a frequent mistake you've seen landowners make when trying to manage their places to withstand or recover from drought? And what advice would you give to avoid those? And what's your top tip or two for building soil health and drought resiliency in grazing lands? And is it worth it? What's the return on investment look like for you for implementing soil health principles? I probably should not have read those all at the same time, Bret, but
I was going to say that's quite a few there, Thomas.
Pick one, we can go from there.
Yeah, I'll take a swing at it. So what are some mistakes that I see? I think, and I made them myself, right? I think not allowing a proper rest when you come out of a drought is a huge mistake. I mean, just because it rains and you have green grass doesn't mean you need to double deck it, and stock it heavy, and utilize it. I mean, you have to pay attention to what, excuse me, you have to pay attention to what your goals are. And if our goals are soil health, and especially on, depending on the drought, right? I mean, some of the droughts are 18, 2 years, 3 years, 5 years in length. I mean, depends on how you define a drought. There's drought 60% of normal precip or 80 or whatever you want to say. But yeah, I think just, not paying attention to the biomass and the grasses and forbs that we have out there on these communities, and maybe paying too much attention to the economics of it, that, most people come out of the drought, you're really, it's tough, because not only are you probably put in a financial, kind of stranglehold during that drought, if you had to sell some cattle, or if you had to, back off, or you had to feed more, which, it's another story for another day. But so I think the biggest mistake I've seen, Thomas, is, going back in and not paying attention to what we should have been paying attention to in the first place, which is soil health and grazing patterns and that type of thing. It's not just because we have rainfall. We get a 2-inch rain, which in our country a lot of times is a pretty good rain and grow a lot of feed, but we still then have to go in there and make sure we don't overgraze it. That grass plant I'm not a soil scientist, but to me, it's a living organism out there, and it just like my cows. And if I abuse my cows and I withhold the nutrients from them, it's, we're going to pay the price. We're going to have skinny cows, you're going to have poor conception rates, you're going to have small calves. Same thing with the grasses. If I go out there and I abuse that grass plant, and I go in there when it's trying to come out of a drought and it's stressed anyway, And I go in there and I continually bite off that growth point and don't allow it to grow and to, regain some health down there in the soil and the root systems, then we're spinning our wheels. So what was the next one, Thomas? I'm sorry.
What's your top tip or two for building soil health and drought resiliency in grazing land?
Yeah, I think the top tip that I would have to anybody is, and again, it's a tough one, right? But you have to maximize soil health. I'll go back to that again. And so what principles does that imply? Dave touched on a while ago, take 50, leave 50. And that doesn't always mean every pasture is the same way. We've got pastures where we've got some annuals that, some layman's love grass, say, or things like that will come on at certain times of year if we have some good rain. And, we will stock that heavier. We might get 70 or 80% usage out of those pastures where we've got some of those kind of grasses. So know your grasses. It also allows us to let, some of our more desirable grasses, our blue stems, our grandmas, that type of thing, gives them a little extra rest if we're doing that. So yeah, I think the most important thing is to learn your country, learn the varieties of grass that you have, understand that diversity is a good thing. I think we've been programmed over the years, I guess, per se, that monocultures are good. We want a monoculture of everything. You want all your rows straight. You don't want any weeds. You don't want, all these different things. And I think, I grew up in country that, we were pretty strong grandma grass country because that's pretty much all we had, the way that the monsoons grew and stuff like that. So, diversity is the key. I think that's something that I really appreciate about the country that we ranch in down there now is that, we've got, we had a range consultant come out a few years ago and he walked out through there and he said, he counted 30 something varieties of grasses in these little circles. So, that's something that we try to manage for, and something that I think is extremely important. So yeah, I think if I could give anybody advice, it would be, try to get to a position where you can leave, more standing forage, build that organic matter. And I think, first 1, 2, 3, 4 years might be tough. It's hard to do that from an economic standpoint. If you see that grass out there, a lot of those guys consider that a paycheck. So, I can run another 15 pairs on a section, not section, but, another 4 or 5 pairs on a section or something like that, then yeah, it gets to be a financial issue. But, I think, again, that's something we're working on through WLA and the Prairie Chicken Alliance is how do we, build some of these, not only programs that going through the government now, but, look at these ecosystem service markets that will help these producers take that step, right? And be able to set some country aside and rest some country and see, and 2, 3, 4 years in, you'll really start to see the benefits from it.
So I think we'll, to honor everybody's time, we promised you for the first hour you'd hear from us, and the second hour we're going to hear from you and we're going to talk. So Dave, we've got just a couple minutes left here. Can you kind of give us that, what's a frequent mistake that you've seen, and what's your top tip for people who are really wanting to build drought resilience and improve the conditions around water scarcity?
Yeah, and out in the West, it all comes back to water. So however we can look at how do we keep water on the land and not have it run off, that's where the soil health comes in, like Bret was touching on, and that all of this grew from conservation and a lot of promotion of conservation. But as I've gone through it through the years, and I'm a conservationist, but I didn't set out to be a conservationist. My end goal is to keep ranching, right? And so I look at all these practices, which they're not new. And I'll tell you right from the get-go, I've never had an original idea. I am just thankful for people sharing ideas of what works. And then we look at, well, can I fit that? Would I do that? Not do that? And evaluate what we can plug in. And so what I call these soil health principles, these are best practices that if we're going to stay ranching into the future, this is going to be commonplace. This is the paradigm of what ranching looks like in the future. And it'll serve us, but we also have to answer to our city cousins because we're going to get held accountable for some of these things as well. And so going back to what are some of the mistakes people make is, and Bret kind of touched on it too, you're going to have some patience in this, and don't start whole hogs. Just educate yourself, go to programs, We support a lot of different educational things. Soil Health School, we have a couple of those, of which we teach people how to graze. And then our sister organization, the Grassland Coalition, has 3 grazing schools across the state, and they just focus on how to do that, both multi-species as well, not just looking at just cattle. And you don't have to own the sheep or the goats. You can find somebody to bring that in and apply it as a tool for improvement. But one of the big mistakes is people set up for expectations, and then it doesn't turn out, and then they're disappointed in that, and then they blame the activity instead of really looking at it. So I you run into people and they'll try to, like, cover crops, and they'll say, okay, I'm going to throw these cover crops in the crop land and it's going to fix my soil. That's a unreasonable expectation. That is one piece or one practice that helps serve the greater good. And it's the same way with grassland management. Just because you leave residue doesn't mean you fix the entire thing. There may be some issues that are going to have to come into play, and diversity being one of them. We've got a lot of invasives that can really harm our native rangelands. So in those cases, we may have to just, Bret touched on it, when we see them, those are opportunities to do a lot of intensive grazing. So that would kind of be it in the nutshell that I would have.
Thank you so much, Dave. And thank you as well to Bret. Your insights gave us a lot to chew on today. A key take home from what I heard is that adaptation and planning for drought needs to happen before water scarcity is an issue, but it's never too late to take action. And now we want to chew on all of this information together. Everyone, please stay with us now to ask your own questions, share your experiences, and discuss what's on your mind with others in this meeting. But thank you very much for being here today.
Yeah, I'm so happy that y'all are hanging on here. So we're gonna move to the talk section. We're gonna turn off the recording, please.